Welcome. So we are doing a series of lectures on similarity clustering. So what's the motivation for this? The motivation is that you have data that's unlabeled and we need to somehow label them. So one way to label them is to find similar clusters of objects. For example, if you have a bunch of pictures in a database, how would you take those pictures and label them if they don't have any labels? And there are many other applications for similarity clustering. So let's get started. So we'll go through a few short lectures, some introduction and methods of what we call k-means clustering, and also applications of k-means and hierarchical clustering, and a summary. So as databases evolve to include vector embeddings, clustering becomes the first-class operation. So in other words, that our databases, vector databases, have embeddings of real objects, such as a document or a picture or something that's been encoded and stored as a vector embedding in a vector database. So for example, let's say you have a bunch of documents or images or code snippets. We would like to organize them in some order. So for example, here we would like to put them into clusters, identifying specific parts of these objects. So what it does is to enable semantic search, which means we can search within the cluster or across clusters, and you can retrieve by pre-grouping these similar content. This is very important because it supports the data cycle management. In other words, that when we get new data, we might be able to put them into the proper cluster. So in the data integration and schema mapping, when we combine data from multiple sources, so clustering can reveal schema or some attribute similarity. For example, let's assume that we had 3 data sets. Dataset A contains certain information, customer ID, unit price, and so on. Dataset B contains other information. Now, there may be an overlap between these data. We like to find out any kind of similarity across these data sets. So for example, if we are able to cluster these data vectors, we might find that we can generate an ID cluster which contains customer ID and client ID, which may mean the same thing, or name cluster where the customer name and the client name may be the same thing, and the price cluster, which indicates things within the price, and some redundant attributes, price, cost, amount, and the data cluster, ordered date, a date cluster, order date, and the transaction. So this kind of thing is very important for data integration and schema mapping. So we can identify redundant tables or attributes in a data lake. So it supports the semantic integration by clustering concept, similar value distribution. So here's another example where we have this group. Let's suppose that we collected data about customers. We only have 2 pieces of data, annual income and spending scope. And if you plot them on a graph, we find that this kind of differentiation. So this seems like this data set contains clusters that may have certain segmentation, like we can find people who have low income but spend more, or people who have high income but spends low, and so on. So people in the middle, medium income, medium spending habits, and so on. So identifying this kind of things in the data set is quite important. We can say the same thing about the student habits, study habits, say study hours and GPA, we plot them, and then we get this kind of thing. But the problem here is that we cannot always plot, because we talk about these data are very high dimensional. In other words, it's not two dimensional like here, where you have income and spending score, but you have a lot more fields in here. In the next video, we'll talk about this k-means clustering.